It began on an ordinary afternoon in 2018 in a village so small it didn't even have a stoplight. A farmer named Lucas Weber had inherited his family's weathered estate on the outskirts of Mittenwald, a patch of farmland framed by pine trees and silence. The barn, a 200-year-old structure leaning tiredly into the hillside, had always been an afterthought, a relic of another time. Lucas planned to reinforce the foundation, replace the rotting beams, and finally put the old place to use. But as he tore away the warped wooden planks near the center of the floor, his crowbar struck metal. At first, he thought it was an old drain cover, maybe something his grandfather had installed long ago. But when he cleared away the dirt, what he found didn't belong to any ordinary farm. It was a steel hatch, circular, with a corroded handle and a faint German word etched into its surface: Zugang verboten, access forbidden. Lucas froze. The air inside the barn suddenly felt colder, heavier. He called the local authorities, who arrived an hour later with flashlights, respirators, and curiosity. Together they pried open the hatch. A hiss of stale air escaped, followed by the hollow clang of metal on stone. A ladder descended into pure darkness. The first officer to go down would later describe it as like stepping into another century. The light from his flashlight revealed concrete walls, shelves of rusted tools, and a single narrow corridor leading deeper underground. The bunker had been sealed tight, no sign of entry for decades. When the team followed the passage, they found something impossible: a subterranean workshop preserved in dust and silence. Tables littered with decayed notebooks, strange metal parts, and sketches of machines no one recognized. A calendar on the wall read May 1946, but the war had ended a year earlier. The bunker shouldn't have existed, neither should the things inside it. When Lucas emerged from the hole, pale and shaking, the villagers gathered in confusion. For generations, they had heard stories about that barn, about strange lights and engines humming beneath the earth. Most dismissed them as folklore. But as the news spread, one name returned to every whisper, one that older villagers remembered from childhood: Der verrückte Mechaniker. Every small town in Bavaria has its stories, but none quite like the legend of the Mad Mechanic. His name, people said, was Kurt Waldmann, a gifted engineer whose mind was as brilliant as it was dangerous. During the final years of the Second World War, he worked in secret for a facility near Munich, designing propulsion systems for experimental aircraft. Some said he dreamed of engines that could fly without fuel, machines that defied gravity itself. Others claimed he was building something far worse. When the war collapsed in 1945, Kurt vanished without a trace. Soldiers looted his workshop, neighbors burned his house to the ground, and official records listed him simply as missing in action. But the villagers of Mittenwald told a different story. They said Kurt didn't flee east with the others. They said he stayed, hiding among them, disguised as a laborer, his genius turned inward and his mind unraveling. Farmers spoke of hearing metallic echoes at night, the rhythmic clang of tools deep beneath the soil. Hikers reported seeing faint blue light rising through the trees on windless evenings, as if the ground itself was breathing. Parents warned their children never to go near the Weber barn, especially after dark. Over time, the war ended, the memories faded, and the story became just that, a story. But not everyone forgot. In 1978, a shepherd claimed he saw a man's silhouette moving behind the barn at midnight, even though the place had been abandoned for years. In 1991, a team of utility workers digging near the property unearthed cables buried deep underground wires that led nowhere. Each incident revived the old whispers: Der Mechaniker lebt noch. The mechanic still lives. And then, for nearly 3 decades, silence again, until Lucas Weber struck metal beneath the barn floor. When authorities descended into the hidden chamber, historians began connecting dots no one wanted to connect. The rumors, it seemed, hadn't been rumors at all. The Mad Mechanic was real, and whatever he had built, he had buried it well. Germany, April 1945. The war was over, only no one dared to say it aloud. Cities lay in ruins, smoke curling through the bones of buildings, and soldiers wandered roads that no longer led anywhere. The Third Reich, once confident in its thousand-year reign, was collapsing in weeks. But behind the chaos, a desperate race was underway, not for victory, but for disappearance. Scientists, engineers, and officers were ordered to erase their work, destroy documents, and vanish before the Allies arrived. In the mountains south of Munich, one of those men was Kurt Waldmann. Officially, he was a mechanical engineer assigned to the Luftwaffe's experimental research unit, working on alternative propulsion. Unofficially, his work was far stranger. Witnesses recalled a sprawling hangar lit through the night by strange bluish light. There were whispers of disc-shaped prototypes, engines that pulsed rather than burned, and machines that made compasses spin wildly. The Allies called them wonder weapons, though most were fantasy. Still, in those final days, fantasy was all the Reich had left. As Allied bombers roared overhead, Kurt's facility was ordered evacuated. Officers arrived in unmarked trucks, collecting scientists and equipment bound for an undisclosed location in the Alps. Records from that week show Kurt signing out several crates of machinery, fuel cells, and notebooks labeled Project Eisenwind. But after that, his name vanishes. No further reports, no surrender, no grave. When American forces reached the site days later, they found the hangar burned to ash, save for one intact section of reinforced flooring and a deep square imprint in the concrete as though something massive had been moved. Intelligence agents combed the wreckage for clues. The name Waldmann appeared on multiple lists of missing personnel, tagged with a single notation, presumed dead or escaped to Austria. But villagers living near the Tyrolean border would tell another story, one about convoys driving through the night, heading toward the Bavarian forests, and the faint metallic hum that lingered long after they passed. Some claim they saw a lone truck break away from the others, driving north instead of south, its headlights disappearing into the woods. If that truck carried Kurt Waldmann, then the war had not ended for him. It had only gone underground. Before the war, Kurt Waldmann had been a rising star in German engineering circles, a man with grease on his hands and galaxies in his head. Born in Leipzig in 1908, he had shown a fascination with motion from the time he could hold a wrench. While other boys built toy trains, Kurt built engines. He was obsessed with efficiency, how to make machines that didn't waste a single drop of energy, that could, as he often said, run forever. He studied mechanical physics at the University of Munich, graduating with honors and immediately attracting the attention of industrial firms experimenting with alternative fuels. Colleagues admired his brilliance but feared his obsession. He thought sleep was a weakness, one former assistant recalled. If a design failed, he'd start again from zero, same night, same hour. By the late 1932, his work had shifted from the practical to the impossible. He spoke of perpetual motion devices and energy vortices, theories that defied conventional science but captivated military minds desperate for advantage. Under the Reich's supervision, Kurt was given resources most scientists only dreamed of: unlimited funding, a private lab, and a team of forced laborers whose names were never recorded. That's when the accidents began. First, a technician was blinded by an arc of white light. Then, an explosion ripped through one of the workshops, leaving only a circular scorch mark on the floor. After that, the facility operated exclusively at night. Locals heard strange humming sounds that rattled windows and sent livestock running. Rumors spread that Waldmann had gone mad, that he wasn't building engines anymore but machines for speaking with the sky. Still, he was protected. The Reich valued results more than sanity. By 1944, Kurt's notes referenced rotational fields, vacuum resonance, and an unnamed experiment he called Das Tor, the Gate. What it meant, no one knew. But when the war finally collapsed, so did Kurt's world. His peers fled or surrendered. He vanished instead, taking his blueprints, his inventions, and his secrets into the mountains where, if the whispers were true, he continued to build. April 1945, Germany was dissolving into chaos. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, the Red Army was at the gates of Berlin, and the South was collapsing under waves of retreating soldiers and refugees. In a factory on the outskirts of Munich, Kurt Waldman worked in silence, ignoring the distant rumble of artillery. The war was lost, but his work, he believed, was not. For months he had been moving his experiments off the books, disassembling machines, boxing up engines, burning his notes except for a single leather-bound journal. He knew the Americans would come for the technology. They always did, and he refused to let them have it. Witnesses later described seeing 2 trucks leaving the facility just before dawn, one hauling equipment covered with tarps, the other filled with fuel drums and metal crates. The drivers were civilians, local laborers who would never be seen again. Kurt sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, a pistol at his side, and the Reichseagle insignia removed from his coat. Their route was deliberate, away from the highways, through back roads winding toward the Bavarian Alps, where the forests grew thick and the mountains could swallow anything. By evening, the convoy reached the outskirts of Mittenwald, a quiet mountain village known for its violin makers and narrow cobblestone streets. Kurt stopped at a roadside inn to refuel and eat. The innkeeper later told investigators that the man spoke with calm precision, his German accent clipped and formal, his hands shaking only when he reached for his coffee. He said he was moving machinery, she recalled, something for agriculture, but when she asked where he was headed, he only smiled and said, "Somewhere the war cannot find me." That night, under a moon veiled in smoke, the 2 trucks drove into the woods southeast of the village and vanished. Locals heard engines echoing off the valley walls until just after midnight, then silence. By morning, there were no tracks, no signs of a crash, not even the scent of fuel. The army swept through days later but found nothing. Some believed the vehicles had tumbled into one of the hidden ravines that scar the Bavarian hills. Others whispered that Kurt had found an old mineshaft and sealed himself inside. Either way, the mechanic was gone. The last trace of him was a smear of oil on a gravel road, slowly drying in the sun. The war ended, but in Mittenwald, the silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire. Occupying troops marched through, rounding up what remained of the Reich soldiers and dismantling abandoned factories. The villagers, woodcutters, craftsmen, shepherds returned to their lives, patching roofs, tending goats, pretending not to remember what they had seen. But the whispers never stopped. In the years after 1945, strange things began happening in the forests above the town. At night, hikers reported hearing faint metallic clanks echoing through the trees, like hammers striking iron far underground. Sometimes the air would hum low, rhythmic, almost mechanical, then vanish when the wind shifted. Hunters spoke of seeing flickers of blue light through the pines, as if someone were welding deep in the woods. They followed the glow but always found nothing. The old Weber barn, perched on a slope overlooking the valley, became the heart of the rumors. No one remembered who built it. Some said it had been part of a farm long abandoned before the war. Others swore it had been requisitioned by the military, used to store fuel or weapons. Children dared each other to sneak inside. Those who did returned pale, claiming they'd heard footsteps beneath the floor. In 1952, a local schoolteacher named Franz Auer began cataloging village folklore for a regional history project. He noted over a dozen separate accounts of engine noises in the soil near the Weber property, and an old woman's recollection of a man visiting her father's forge after the war, paying in gold coins to have steel cut into strange circular plates. By then, most of the villagers had accepted the myth. The mad mechanic had never left. He had dug his way under the mountain, continuing his work in secret while the world above rebuilt itself. When children disappeared into the woods, parents would murmur that the mechanic took them. When storms rattled the barn roof, old men crossed themselves and shut the shutters tight. Mittenwald moved on, but the stories lingered like smoke, unseen, unforgotten, waiting for the day the earth itself would give up its secret. 70 years later, the village of Mittenwald had become the kind of place that only existed on postcards, sloping pastures, red-roofed cottages, and a church bell that marked time slower than the rest of the world. The war was a memory spoken about only in history lessons and family whispers. But for Lucas Weber, it was something that lived in the creaking bones of his inheritance. When his father passed away in 2017, Lucas took ownership of the Weber property, a stretch of farmland at the base of the Carwendel Mountains, and the old barn that came with it. The structure leaned into the hillside, its beams blackened by time and its roof patched in layers of mismatched wood. Lucas had spent most of his life ignoring it. His grandfather, stern and secretive, had always forbidden anyone from entering the central section of the barn. "Storage," he used to say when Lucas asked what was beneath the covered floorboards. "Nothing you need to see." Over the years, those words hardened into superstition. Children in the village joked that the Weber barn was haunted. Teenagers used it as a landmark to scare one another. But to Lucas, it was just an old building until the storm. In March 2018, a violent wind ripped across the valley, tearing shingles from rooftops and collapsing part of the barn wall. When Lucas inspected the damage days later, he noticed something odd. The floor near the center of the barn was warped, slightly higher than the rest, as if something solid pressed up from below. The boards there were different, too thicker, newer, and nailed down in a perfect square. His grandfather had clearly replaced them, though no one knew why. Lucas crouched down and ran his fingers along the seam. Beneath the wood he could hear a hollow echo. He fetched a crowbar and began prying, each pull releasing a puff of dust older than his lifetime. It took him half an hour to loosen the boards, revealing cold metal underneath an edge of rusted steel hidden just below the surface. The shape was circular, about a meter across, with a faint ring carved into its center. Lucas brushed away the dirt, and for the first time, sunlight touched something that hadn't seen the light of day since before he was born. That's when he saw the word engraved along the rim, Zugang verboten. Access forbidden. His breath caught. He stood up, staring at the thing in disbelief, a tremor of unease crawling up his spine. He had no idea what he'd just uncovered, but the past, it seemed, had been waiting for him. It took Lucas nearly an hour to work up the courage to touch it again. The hatch was thick and cold, a slab of metal fused with rust and time. Its handle barely moved, welded shut by decades of corrosion. He hit it with a hammer, once, twice, until the hinge gave a hollow crack that echoed through the barn like thunder. When the seal finally broke, a rush of air spilled upward, stale, heavy, and impossibly cold. Beneath the opening was a shaft lined in concrete and shadow. A ladder descended into darkness, each rung slick with condensation. Lucas shined his flashlight into the void, but the beam seemed to vanish halfway down, swallowed by the dark. He stepped back, heart pounding, then did what any rational man would do. He called the police. By dusk, 2 patrol cars and a fire crew surrounded the barn, the blue lights casting strange reflections across the old timbers. The officers lowered a camera into the hole first, expecting perhaps an old cellar, maybe a war-era shelter. What the camera showed instead left them silent. There was no rubble, no debris, just a corridor stretching out from the base of the ladder, lined with smooth concrete walls and metal doors. It was far too modern for a pre-war structure, yet the decay was unmistakable. When the first officer descended, his radio crackled with static. "It's bigger than it looks," he said, his voice echoing faintly. There's something down here." The others followed, their flashlights cutting through layers of dust that hung in the air like fog. The bunker felt untouched, preserved in perfect stillness. Along the walls were workbenches cluttered with rusted tools, yellowed blueprints pinned beneath cracked glass, and shelves stacked with jars filled with dark, unidentifiable liquids. A table held a single object, an old military helmet with the insignia scratched away. The calendar on the wall stopped at May 1946. The ink had barely faded. "Whoever built this," one officer whispered, "kept working after the war ended." But the question wasn't just who it was. Why? And somewhere deeper in that bunker, the answer was waiting, sealed in the dark for over 70 years. The bunker stretched farther than anyone expected. At first glance, it looked like a relic from the war-bare concrete walls sweating moisture. exposed pipes running along the ceiling, but the deeper the investigators moved, the stranger it became. There were 3 main chambers, each filled with remnants of a workshop that time had forgotten. The air smelled of oil, dust, and something faintly metallic, as if the machines themselves still breathed. Rusted tools hung neatly on pegs, untouched for decades. Drafting tables were buried beneath stacks of papers, their edges curled and browned, the ink smudged but still legible in places. Diagrams of engines and coils were drawn in meticulous, looping script, labeled with words like Magnetfeld and Plasmaleitung. It wasn't military work, it was obsession. One table was covered entirely in glass jars, each labeled in Kurt Waldman's precise handwriting, Versuch #27 Organisches Medium. Inside them floated murky, amber-colored fluids with shapes that might once have been organic. Some contained fragments of what looked disturbingly like skin, though degraded beyond recognition. Others held nothing but residue and air bubbles. The light from their flashlights bounced off the glass, making the jars seem alive, as if they pulsed when no one was looking. In the next chamber stood a hulking piece of machinery, half turbine, half engine, its metal casing warped and fused in places. Wires snaked from it into the walls and floor, vanishing into conduits that seemed to go on forever. A rusted generator sat nearby, still connected by cables that hummed faintly when touched, as though it still remembered power. Along the far wall, someone, perhaps Kurt himself, had scrawled formulas and diagrams in black paint, now cracked and faded. In one corner, a small iron cot and a rotting table suggested that whoever worked here had lived here too. On the table sat a tin cup, a Bible in German, and a photograph of a man in uniform standing beside a prototype engine. His face was lean, sharp, the eyes unsettlingly focused. The back of the photo bore a single date, 12, Mars 1946. As the team continued documenting the room, one officer remarked that it didn't feel abandoned, not really. "It's like he just stepped out for a moment," he said quietly, glancing toward the corridor beyond. No one replied. The silence in the bunker felt almost deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. They found the tapes in a locked steel cabinet near the far end of the main chamber, 13 reels stacked neatly beside a microphone and a logbook. The covers were labeled only by date, beginning in late 1945 and ending abruptly in June 1946. When the reels were restored and played in a lab days later, the voice that filled the speakers was calm, deliberate, and chillingly lucid. "Test number 4, the man began in measured German. "Rotation sustained for 18 minutes. Magnetic resonance achieved." His accent was unmistakable. It was Kurt Waldman. The early recordings were technical, filled with precise measurements, descriptions of experiments, and musings about uninterrupted energy flow and field coherence. But as the tapes progressed, something shifted. His tone grew erratic. Pauses stretched longer. In one recording he said, "The field breathes now, it reacts." He spoke of heatless light, of invisible pressure, of an engine that feeds itself. He mentioned hearing a low-frequency humming when the device reached resonance, like the voice of the earth itself. By tape 9, his voice had changed entirely, quieter, paranoid. He spoke as though someone else was in the room. "I've begun to hear them when the machine runs. Whispers, no, harmonics. Beneath the mountain. Not from the air, but from the stone." He mentioned seeing movement in the reflection of the glass jars, shapes that shouldn't exist. The final tape ended abruptly mid-sentence, after a long period of silence and labored breathing. Before it cut off, he said, "If anyone finds this, don't activate the generator. It is not energy we have captured. It is hunger." The technicians who restored the tapes refused to handle them afterward, claiming they heard faint murmurs even when the reels weren't playing. Officially, the recordings were archived and sealed under state authority. Unofficially, several copies circulated online within weeks, fragments of a man's descent into madness, or perhaps the evidence of something far stranger. Whatever had lived beneath the mountain, Kurt Waldman had heard it first. When the recovered blueprints were first brought to Munich for examination, Historians assumed they were simply more of Kurt Waldman's eccentric engine sketches. But as the archivists carefully unfolded the delicate, dust-stained pages, it became immediately clear these were not blueprints for any known machine. The diagrams showed a circular craft, broad, domed, with a central core surrounded by concentric rings labeled Magnetische Feldkammern magnetic field chambers. Arrows indicated rotational movement in opposite directions, forming a vortex of magnetic polarity. It looked nothing like an airplane. Nothing like any propulsion system of the 1942. The design was clean, advanced, decades ahead of its time. Some of the younger analysts whispered the word no one wanted to say aloud: Flugscheibe, flying disc. Others mentioned Die Glocke, the rumored Nazi Bell project, said to generate anti-gravity through electromagnetic resonance. Most dismissed such theories as myth, but the similarity was undeniable. When one historian compared the dimensions to declassified U.S. intelligence documents from the 1952, the resemblance was eerie. The same rotational schematics, the same field pattern just drawn 10 years earlier. Yet this was not what unsettled them most. In the corner of one blueprint, written in bright red ink that had faded only slightly over time, were 6 chilling words: Test erfolgreich 12 Mai 1946. Test successful May 12, 1946. A full year after Germany's surrender, the ink was unmistakably Waldman's, his looping signature beneath it. But that date should have been impossible. By then, the Allied occupation had already dismantled all known facilities, and the region was under strict military control. If Waldman had conducted an experiment that late, it meant he had survived long after the war and had somehow continued his work in secret. The analysts debated the meaning of the notation. Was it an exaggeration? A fantasy written by a man who had lost his mind in isolation? Or had he truly built something that worked? On one page, a sketch of the generator was annotated with a phrase written hastily in pencil: Stille nach dem Licht, silence after the light. Whatever that meant, it didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like warning. The team cataloged the pages under restricted access, but not before a few blurry photographs leaked online, reigniting conspiracy theories about Nazi technology, time distortions, and the Kecksburg Bell. Yet one question lingered over them all. If the test had been successful, then what exactly had Kurt Waldman created? 2 days after the discovery of the blueprints, forensic teams returned to the Mittenwald bunker to complete a final sweep. Most of the chambers had already been mapped, catalogued, and photographed, but one section of the concrete corridor remained sealed by a heavy steel door fused shut by rust. Cutting through it took nearly an hour. When it finally gave way, the officers were hit by a wave of air so cold it stung their lungs. Inside was a small, windowless room bare, except for a single workbench, a rusted stool, and the remains of a man slumped in the corner. His skeleton sat upright, head bowed slightly, the posture almost peaceful. The bones were draped in the tattered remnants of a military jacket, the insignia long decayed but still faintly visible beneath grime. A small flashlight lay on the floor beside one hand, its casing cracked open. On the wall behind the skeleton, written in soot or perhaps burnt oil, were 5 words scrawled in uneven letters. Es funktioniert, aber nicht, wie ich dachte. It works, but not as I thought. Forensic analysis dated the remains to the late 1942. A rusted name tag fragment bore a single engraved letter, W. The investigators didn't need more than that. The skull showed no sign of trauma, no bullet wound, no breakage, just stillness, as if the man had sat down and never risen again. Nearby, a journal lay half buried under debris. Most of its pages were too water-damaged to read, but one intact entry carried the date the 13th of May, 1946, the day after the supposed test. In shaky handwriting, the final line read, "The engine turns, but the light does not die. It speaks." The scientists who entered that room refused to stay long. One swore he felt the temperature drop even further as they photographed the scene. Another said he heard faint humming, like the echo of distant machinery, though the power had been cut hours before. The remains were eventually removed under the supervision of federal authorities and transported to Munich for examination. Officially, the body was listed as unknown male, mid-42. Unofficially, everyone knew who it was. Kurt Waldman had never left his workshop. Whatever he had built, it had killed him, or perhaps worse, it had worked exactly as he intended. Within a week, the sleepy calm of Mittenwald vanished under the weight of black vans, uniformed officers, and unmarked vehicles. The authorities moved quickly, fencing off the Weber property and declaring the entire site a restricted zone. Officially, the reason was mundane: environmental contamination, the papers said, a possible chemical leak from an old military storage facility. But the villagers knew better. The barn where Lucas Weber had found the hatch was gutted overnight. Men in hazmat suits worked under floodlights until dawn, carrying out crates wrapped in plastic, their contents hidden from view. When locals tried to approach, they were turned away by soldiers who claimed to be environmental technicians. No one had ever seen technicians carrying rifles before. Within days, every mention of the bunker disappeared from Bavarian news outlets. The local reporter who had broken the story online suddenly retracted it, claiming he had misinterpreted the events. His website vanished that same night. Lucas Weber, now considered a witness, was relocated under temporary protective custody. He stopped returning calls from friends. When his cousin visited his home weeks later, the doors were locked and the mailbox stuffed with unopened letters. Still, information has a way of escaping. A handful of photographs, grainy, poorly lit, surfaced on obscure message boards. The outline of circular machinery, a soot-stained wall bearing German writing, and what looked like a human skeleton on the floor. A short audio clip followed soon after, allegedly from one of the recovered reels. In it, a man's voice, measured, weary, murmured, "Es let, I am Magnetfeld. It lives in the magnetic field." Experts debated its authenticity, but the clip spread too fast to contain. Then came reports of NATO-marked aircraft landing at a private airstrip near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, and witnesses claiming to see foreign scientists escorted into the mountains. Official statements dismissed the rumors as routine joint research operations. But villagers noticed something strange in the weeks that followed. The old Weber barn was demolished entirely. The ground beneath it flattened and receded, as if the land itself had to forget. By autumn, only a rectangle of newer grass marked where it had stood. Yet those who had seen the photographs couldn't unsee them. Whatever the government had taken from that bunker, it wasn't just relics of the past, it was something still pulsing with the power of obsession, secrecy, and fear. The silence didn't last. Within months, the story of the Mad Mechanics bunker exploded across online forums and conspiracy channels. Armchair historians compared Waldman's blueprints to declassified sketches of experimental aircraft. UFO enthusiasts insisted he had discovered a form of anti-gravity propulsion decades before Roswell. He cracked the field barrier, one post claimed. The Allies covered it up, then rebuilt it in the 1950 seconds. Others pointed to the tapes, arguing that Waldman's reference to voices beneath the mountain hinted at something metaphysical, even supernatural. Some believed he had opened a dimensional rift, others that he had tapped into an energy source humanity was never meant to touch. A physicist writing under a pseudonym proposed that the engine wasn't an engine at all, but a self-contained resonance field, one capable of distorting time and space on a small scale. According to his calculations, if the machine had run unchecked, its energy signature could have looped back upon itself, creating a localized temporal distortion. If that's true, the Post concluded, then Waldman's experiment didn't end in 1946. It's still running, just not in our time. Skeptics dismissed the talk as internet hysteria, yet a few details were harder to ignore. Several residents living near the original site reported strange electrical fluctuations, compasses spinning erratically, phone batteries draining overnight, lights flickering for no reason. Satellite imagery showed subtle heat signatures emanating from the soil where the barn had stood, though no official explanation was given. A retired NATO technician, interviewed anonymously, claimed that scientists had attempted to restart the machine under controlled conditions, but shut it down when the instruments started reading negative time. Most dismissed it as a hoax. Still, the legend grew. For some, Kurt Waldman was a lost genius, a man who glimpsed the next stage of energy evolution before madness claimed him. For others, he was a warning, a symbol of human arrogance reaching too far into forces it could not comprehend. And for the few who still lived in Mittenwald, he was neither myth nor metaphor. On still nights, when the wind died and the valley fell silent, they swore they could hear it again, the low hum beneath the earth, as if somewhere deep below, the mechanic's machine had never really stopped. In the end, the official report said almost nothing. 27 pages of bureaucratic language that concluded with a single hollow line: experimental machinery of unknown function. No further investigation recommended. The files were sealed, the artifacts transferred to a facility outside Stuttgart, and the case quietly forgotten. But in Mittenwald, forgetting was never an option. The villagers who had grown up with the legend, who had heard the stories whispered by their grandparents about the strange lights and the humming under the hills, now understood that it hadn't been imagination or superstition. It had been memory. History echoing through the soil. They said the government could erase files and demolish barns, but they couldn't erase the feeling that something still lingered beneath the mountains. On foggy mornings, hikers still found old steel fragments half buried in the earth, curved, metallic pieces unlike any farming tool or weapon. Children still dared one another to walk the fields at night, listening for the hum that locals swore returned whenever the air was perfectly still. Lucas Weber never came back to the village. Some said he moved north, changed his name, and refused to speak about what he found. Others whispered that he'd been taken in by the same people who fenced off the land. A few believed he'd gone searching for another bunker, one hidden even deeper. Whatever the truth, the story of the mad mechanic took on a life of its own. Journalists turned it into documentaries, historians debated its meaning, and conspiracy forums elevated Kurt Waldman to near-mythic status, a genius who crossed the line between science and madness, between progress and damnation. Yet for those who stood where the Weber barn once stood, the story felt simpler and sadder. Kurt Waldman hadn't been a monster or a magician. He was a man who believed too deeply in his own vision, a mind unwilling to accept limits in a world collapsing around him. When the war ended, he didn't flee. He turned inward, burrowed into the mountain, and kept building until there was nothing left of him but bones and blueprints. The dream that had once promised salvation became his tomb. The government's report could dismiss him as an anomaly, but the people of Mittenwald knew better. The mad mechanic had never left Germany. He'd been there all along, deep beneath their feet, still chasing the impossible dream of endless power, until it consumed him, and perhaps, in some way, the world above him too. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.